This is one of the most unusual internet servers that ever existed, because it was located in the very center of the Chernobyl Zone, in the dead city of Pripyat. In the 1990s, it was a part of something much bigger, something you can still find in the Internet Archive. This is a story of the very strange Chernobyl Internet. If you have long been interested in the history of Chernobyl, you probably have noticed one strange detail. The first year after the disaster has been studied almost minute by minute. But then, after the completion of the sarcophagus, detailed information starts appearing again mainly only in the 2000s. And the period in between remains almost unexplored. In the 1990s, the zone was far more dangerous than it is now. And because of that, it was still almost completely closed off, so traditional media rarely had a chance to look inside. But in reality, there was happening truly a lot. At that time, the zone became a place of large-scale scientific research. Its goal was to understand how the world could coexist with the phenomenon of Chernobyl, which turned out to be not temporary, but permanent. This required the work of thousands of people, and it required an enormous amount of information. But what if I told you that 30 years ago, in this setting, the Chernobyl zone itself, dangerous, closed, and almost unreachable, became one of the first places in Ukraine to go online? And all of you can still explore the relics of those Chernobyl servers in the Internet Archive Wayback Machine. The first such relic is this now non-existent website, olmi.kiev.ua. The Internet Archive contains only one snapshot, from 2001. But most of the pages on it had not changed since 1998. At first glance, it is a typical webpage of that era. But what makes it unique is that it is the only known website that was physically hosted in the city of Pripyat. Let's translate it into English. So, this is the Department of Laboratory Research Methods, abbreviated OLMI, of the State Specialized Enterprise RADEK. Back in the day, RADEK was a big thing. It carried out constant radiation and ecological monitoring of the entire Chernobyl zone. It also accounted doses the employees of the zone received during their work. But the interesting detail is that their main premises were in the very center of Pripyat, in the former vocational school building near the famous Ferris wheel, and it functioned up to 2000. Its laboratories, however, were in another part of the city, in two small buildings near the fire station. And this is where the servers for this website operated. For the 1990s, this photograph is an extremely rare case where we can see the behind-the-scenes work of the zone. That's because at that time, just to get there, you needed a serious reason and months of approvals. But some people managed it, and one of them was Yegor Yegorov, then a journalist for PC World Ukraine magazine. In the spring of 1998, he came to the zone to report on its computer infrastructure. And we were able to contact him, so he shared these unique photographs and interesting details. The head of OLMI was Alexander Kovalyov, and under his supervision were 4 laboratories and 12 employees. On the website you could find their historical email addresses and their internal phone numbers in Pripyat. As you see, they consisted of only a couple of digits. The site also had an administrator login and intranet login, but unfortunately neither of these pages were preserved. But then there is a section about the laboratory's local network, which was called JANIS. Here has been preserved a list of administrative users, but on the page with network topology the image is missing. But fortunately, back in 1998, Yegor was able to talk to its administrator, Andriy Porokhnyak. That's him in his office in Pripyat, and this man effectively built a significant part of the zone's network infrastructure, which, as you will see, extended far beyond Pripyat. 28 years later, he no longer works in the zone, but we were able to speak with him, and he agreed to share really interesting details with us. The missing image on that website was this. This is the topology of the JANIS network. In total, there were 21 computers, ranging from 286 machines to Pentium 2 systems. Each was used for their own tasks, for example, spectrometry, chromatography or hydrology. The network covered 2 buildings connected via overhead line based on coaxial cable, and each building had its own file server. Inside the network, for convenience, all the machines were named after singers and musical groups. For example, Chris was named after Chris Ree, and Alice was named after Alice Cooper. Well, we invite you to guess who the others were named after, so just write your guesses in the comments. However, the JANIS network was not the only internet node in Pripyat. Another one belonged to the Chernobyl Center for International Research. So recently I spoke with our friend Igor Chizhevsky, who back in the day worked in that laboratory. And he told me that, like RADEK showed me, the center had its own dedicated line to Chernobyl and internet access. Unfortunately, at the moment Igor could not recall more details, so he suggested that I contact its former system administrator. So if I succeed, we'll surely have a separate episode about that internet node, so stay tuned. Now, from all these facilities, the lines converged in the Pripyat Communication Center. You surely know this building. It stands right next to the central square. Originally it housed the city's post office and automatic telephone exchange. After the evacuation, the equipment inside remained functional, so years later the building proved useful again. However, the telephone lines themselves were a very different matter. By memories, to make this network work, Andriy and his colleagues literally had to search for lines that were still functional. They manually checked their electrical parameters and listened to determine how much noise was present on each line. And the best speed they were able to achieve was about 9 kilobits per second, well, assuming conditions not that bad. From Pripyat Phone Central, the slow modem line stretched through the contaminated lands and eventually reached the town of Chernobyl. Its destination was the Chernobyl InfoCenter, the information brain of the zone. The center was created in 1995 and it had to solve a few problems. You see, just like the internet at the time, Chernobyl had not yet become the new normal, neither in Ukraine nor in the world. So the zone required a colossal amount of scientific information from outside, but the demand from information and use from inside was actually comparable. But initially it was all about building local networks in Chernobyl. Then, in the end of 1996, here in the communication center was created the very first internet node. It consisted of a few FreeBSD servers and a few modems. From one of them came a 57 kilobit link to Kiev, to the internet service provider Elvisti. And InfoCenter, in its turn, became an internet service provider for the entire zone. And this was the moment when they went online, creating the main website. It was IC Chernobyl Kiev UA, which opened in November 1996 and existed up to 2015. Everything after, there were unrelated websites or various redirects. The first preserved version dates to May 4, 1997. Well, it's very simple and consists of a mixture of pages in English, Ukrainian and Russian. And it looked like this until mid-2000. But despite its simplicity, there is a lot interesting material here. There is a large list of more than 20 enterprises that worked in the zone at that moment, and some of them even had own pages. In another section, there is information about the radiation situation from 3 sensors, one in Chernobyl, one in Pripyat, and one at the industrial site of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Even at a glance, it's clear that those levels were higher than they are now. What is interesting, back in the day you could call an answering machine and listen to this information by voice. 04493 is actually a telephone code for Chernobyl town. And here is the section with the news from the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. You could see how much energy had been generated or what work had been carried out and where. At that time, the nuclear power plant yet didn't have its own website. There are also publications here, including the famous Problems of the Chernobyl Zone. That's an almanac that publishes some of the most important scientific articles. It's actually published even today and is known as a Yellow Book because since the very beginning its cover has never changed. There are also articles from another collection, the Bulletin of Ecological State of the Zone. These include works written by the RADEK team, which we discussed earlier. A bit later here also appeared a list of enterprises and employees for whom the InfoCenter Chernobyl provided internet access. But among the names there are truly legendary people, for example ecologist Andriy Porokhnyak, or the major expert on problems of Unit 4 Alexander Kluchnikov, who you may remember from our previous episodes. Sadly, some of these names in the list now belong to people we can no longer contact, not by mail, not in any other way. So their old addresses remain like tiny digital traces. Over time, several other sections appeared on the website, for example, even a guest book. Well, it's not very large, but it contains quite a few messages in English. Since many links were not crawled, the easiest way to find more is to look in the list of saved URLs, especially those that begin with a tilde. This way I could find some personal pages of employees. Or here is another page. And if you think about this, freeform pages like this are simply unimaginable for modern governmental websites, but back then it was normal. What? There is also a page for RADEK itself, and it contains a lot of information about the divisions that were located in Pripyat. But on the page about the site, it is directly stated that the server is located in the zone and it was operating since June 1997. They even wrote about the very first visit to the site from the outside world, from beyond the Chernobyl zone. Speaking about access from beyond the zone, multiple separate servers connected to the InfoCenter were accessible from internet. For example, the website of Olmi we looked before had another address, starting with Americium 241. So all of them were named after isotopes. In a similar way, by exploring archived links, I could find the first separate website for the Sarcophagus over the Reactor 4. It was created in 1998. And there are some interesting things. For example, after so many years in Chernobyl, I had absolutely no idea that the sarcophagus actually had its own logo. Other than that, the site contains a lot of general information about Unit 4 and the work being carried out there. Starting in 2001, the IC Chernobyl website changed its design and content several times. And frankly, each time it became more and more official in its information. Well, some interesting individual things appeared here, but most of it became fairly boring content. Nevertheless, while studying these versions, I was able to find a number of interesting links. For example, cnpp.atom.gov.ua, the first website of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, which was located at the subdomain of the State Committee for Nuclear Energy. Well, if you click on it, the first copy will be a hosting provider landing page, but if you scroll to 1998, you will see this. There is this strange placeholder that simply says, "Welcome to Zona." Nothing here is clickable, and there is nothing in the page source code either. Well, you have to admit, it's impossible to imagine something like this placeholder on a government website in today's internet. Something meaningful appears only in 2000, but none of the images were preserved. The 2002 version, however, already works. There you can read general information about the power plant and look at the photo gallery. However, only one gallery at first glance is available, with pictures from the closure of the plant in December 2000. Later in the web archive, the site is already fairly modern, and I actually still remember it being online. But I was still curious whether there is anything behind that mysterious placeholder, so I decided to look in the list of all saved URLs. And my assumption turned out to be completely correct. There were many photos from the time when the power plant was still generating electricity. That alone makes them very rare, because photography at the operating nuclear power plant is normally very restricted. There are visits by officials to the plant, shots from the turbine hall, shots from the control room of Unit 3, and this, if I'm not mistaken, is the backup reactor control panel. There are also many photographs of repair works, and some of them are quite epic. In a similar way, I discovered that at the same time the Chernobyl nuclear power plant had another website dedicated exclusively to its history. It was located at chernobyl.ukartel.net, and it was apparently created for the closure of the plant. It contains short articles about the Chernobyl nuclear power plant itself, Pripyat, Slavutich, the shelter object, and other facilities. But we have only looked at the websites that were mostly hosted directly in the Chernobyl zone. Here let me remind you, around 1996-1997 websites were still a relatively new phenomenon. And still a lot was happening in completely other services. For example, there were several FidoNet nodes in the zone, one of which was managed in Pripyat by Andriy Porokhnyak. Also, Andriy confirmed a rumor that there was at least one BBS, or Bulletin Board System, which belonged to Chernobyl nuclear power plant. I guess I will try to reach its former system operator and probably will have a new story to explore soon. And it's really cool that this relic has survived, because now, 30 years later, practically everything here is online. You can easily visit the website of Chernobyl nuclear power plant or a successor of RADEK, EcoCenter Enterprise. They all are physically located in Chernobyl, but you can follow them as easy as just watching YouTube. Even Pripyat now has LTE coverage. But somewhere inside the Internet Archive, these first traces are still there, fragments of a time when the closed zone quietly went online. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe, there will be a lot more interesting. Bonus materials, as always, are available on our Patreon page. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next one.